Hello, my name is Tara. I'm from San Diego, California. And recently I published a paper in the Critical Debates in Humanities, Science, and Global Justice Journal titled Unfiltered Lens, Social Media as Threat to Democracy. And the reason why I wanted to talk about censorship specifically is because I feel like just with social media and its rise in this generation specifically, we haven't addressed the different types of algorithms and problems that can come from it, which I will be talking about in the presentation. And I feel like there's not much knowledge distributed about such problems. And I just want to educate more people about it because I do think that censorship can spread through social media very quickly, actually. Okay, so just talking about censorship throughout history, these are some examples that I found. Kukulon and Chichen Itza is from the Incan Empire, and this was a censorship of education because certain scholars figured out how to, when the sun would set, show a serpent coming down the pyramids, and it was all mathematical. It wasn't like there was no actual serpent, but the subjects of the Incan Empire would be scared because to them it would be seen as like a serpent coming down the pyramid, and they would then listen to the people in power, and this censorship education then uh, contributed to the control that any sort of dictator would have in the Incan Empire. And then the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages would censor the Bible. During this time, all the Bibles were written in Latin, which was dying language back then, as it is now. And so the whole Protestant Reformation focused on allowing people to then read the Bible by translating it into more spoken languages such as German, because up until that point, Christians would have to then listen to some sort of interpretation of the Bible, so that would then censor the Bible directly. And more recently, in the 1930s, Holodomor in Ukraine was a genocide that most people don't even really talk about because of how censored it was. And basically, under Stalin's regime in the USSR, certain Ukrainian farmers would then gain more wealth. And because under a communist regime, you can't have more people like more wealthy than others. And so he would then isolate the farmers until like they would die of starvation. And during this time period, there was no census taken. And so to this day, we don't know in millions how many people actually died because of how censored it was to the outside world. And so these are all examples of direct censorship, which is typically through government-driven measures and very intentional, whereas indirect censorship can manifest through language barriers and misunderstandings, and it's very unintentional. So the example to the right is a language barrier. So Holocauston is a Greek-derived word, and it means sacrifice, like a godly sacrifice. And it's very similar, and it's where the definition Holocaust comes from. And I'm from the US, and so out of the 300 million people who live here, all of us don't like actually agree that the Holocaust was a great sacrifice and that it should be thought of like that. But we talk about it with that word because we don't know otherwise. But in countries like France and Israel, they use the Hebrew word Shoah, which means um, tragedy, like great tragedy. And so by saying Holocaust over and over again, you're actually giving this idea that the Holocaust was like this great sacrifice instead of what it actually was, which is a great tragedy. And so it's very unintentional and it comes to like a lot of misunderstandings. And so the terms that I wanted to define are epicenic bubbles and echo chambers. And so these two are used a lot interchangeably, but they're very different actually. And so an epicenic bubble is when a person lacks connection to that restricts their pursuit of outer knowledge and immensely increases their self-confidence and validation. And so all of us are in some form of epistemic bubble, whether or not like we know it. And so it could be simply like if I like to knit, I'm in an epistemic bubble for knitting communities, whereas um so then I won't find other knowledge about something maybe like sewing because I'm just specifically in that knitting community. So it doesn't have to always be very harmful, but it can be harmful. And then echo chambers, however, are more similar to cults, where you're actively closing off outside information to you, and only believing in one specific person or one specific idea, choosing to then like close yourself off. And so they both are very different, but they both have very similar effects in that they polarize their audience. And here are some of the effects that can happen if you are in one. Whether like the grandness of it can change, but the effects of being in one are the reinforcement of pre-existing beliefs. If you're in an epistemic bubble and you're only seeing one side of things, it can skew your perception of how like if you're a majority or not. So for example, if like I'm in the KKK, that's not a majority in the US, but if I'm only talking to other KKK members, I will feel as if, oh, majority of people think the same way I do, so I am right in that sense. But it's not actually true, and because they're closing themselves off from other different perspectives and they don't have this diversity when they're like considering like what to believe in. Intolerance to conflicting ideas if I'm only ever seeing one side of a situation or one side of people, and I see a different type of person from me, you may be scared, and that can increase intolerance, such as like racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. Vulnerability to misinformation increases because if you're believing in one person or idolizing one person, such as like a politician, for example, whom you should never idolize, if you believe in what they're saying like unconditionally, then if they tell you something that is actually wrong, you are very vulnerable to them because you have been believing in that one person without critiquing them in the past, and you are more susceptible to misinformation. And then tribalism and division, if I'm only surrounded myself by other Indian Americans, for example, I will feel a really strong sense of being Indian American. When I see someone who isn't Indian American, then I might feel threatened or more divided or different from them. And that just destroys the concept of unity, and it then like divides our country even further. Okay, so all of these can be applicable to social media algorithms. Facebook, Google, and Amazon all collect user data, such as search histories, followers, followed accounts, content that you've liked, etc. And Axicom, a private company, possesses 96% of American data and a half of user data billion globally. And this data isn't private, it's accessible to anyone willing to pay. And so private corporations can then control media if they have access to this account. And so basically, you'd be wondering, like, how do they use this data to control each other? When they have user data, if I'm like a pro-Trump account and I'm following Trump, I'm following pro-Trump accounts, I'm liking his campaigns, and I'm following along with that. When private corporations see that, okay, this user is pro-Trump, they're not going to show me anti-Trump media because that will steer me away from the app. Facebook, Google, and Amazon don't have any interest in the ethics behind keeping their users interested, but they just want to keep their users active on their platforms. And so the incentive to keep users overrules ethics, to diversify the media, to show objective media. It's more of just like, what can I show people to keep them more interested in coming back for more, and then fund like their own companies, like basically. And so there are solutions to these problems, such as nudging and boosting, which is basically when a social media setting that will redirect users to unbiased, more objective news. And so nudging is when they just purely just guide individual away from certain media by presenting alternative media. And this could be like an ad that pops up, or another like link that could just show up. And also it slows the rapid spread of information. And that could be, there are examples that are like existing right now, such as like on Instagram. If you click a post of maybe like COVID-19 or about like the 2020 election, there can be a little blurb at the bottom saying this post may contain misinformation. You may want to think about twice about like spreading it because it could be false. And so that then just slows down the spread because people are more conscious about what is true and what is not true, whereas before there would be no blurb at the bottom that tells people, oh, this is true and this is not true. And then boosting is more about focusing on your individual self and improving yourself and media literacy, which could be like an educational program to teach how to decipher fake from real news. And so boosting has to follow nudging. First, to get to the point where we want to educate people, we have to also first have people who are looking at unbiased news sources first. And AI has always been like a discussion in the solution to this problem. And there are pros and cons to this. The pro is that for AI, they can personalize nudging intervention. So, for example, if I'm like a mother and I have a toddler, if I'm looking at some sort of false information website and an ad pops up and it's like, oh, send your kids to this daycare, like this is like, there's really good reviews on it, I'm more entitled to click on that ad. Whereas, like, if I'm a teenager, an ad about daycares is not going to steer me away from that misinformation website. So AI will then personalize those interventions by using user data from like Axicom, and they'll show a more relevant ad. For me, if I'm a teenager, they'll show maybe like college applications, like maybe different colleges, or like college counselors, maybe something with like SATs and something like that. Something that's more relevant to my domain and my age group that would be more successful in directing people away. Because if you have only one type of um, intervention, it's a generalization, and that's harder to be more successful. But there are concerns with this because the minute you put in AI, there is a concern of black box. And black box is when there's like an input and there's an output, but there's not really very much knowledge on what's going in the code. Excuse me, and how the code is getting from point A to point B. And so this can lead to further censorship because there is really no emotions in AI. And there actually was a good example of this a while back with Tay and Microsoft on Twitter, where this AI bot became like very harmful and became like a Nazi after a couple of days being online because it was fed information from other users. And so there is concern with AI because it isn't very emotionally intelligent. Okay, so conclusions to this. As of right now, with the lack of relevance in laws and in Congress, how we're not talking about these things right now, you really only 100% guaranteed success to avoiding fake news and fake websites is to increase your own media literacy. And this can be through implementing classes in schools where students are taught media literacy, um, just doing more research one-on-one for yourself to increase media literacy. Because as of right now, a lot of the companies we go to, a lot of the websites we go on are not, they don't have your best incentive at heart. And so you can't necessarily trust them and what they're promoting to really be like the objective news. And so as of right now, the best thing to do is to just focus on media literacy yourself. Thank you.
Awesome job, Tara. We have a question. Do you think corporations will have an incentive to engage in nudging and boosting if all they care about is keeping users active on their platform?
I think some would be interested in nudging because there are past examples, like Instagram is already taking steps to do nudging. Boosting is more, I would say not like an online thing. It's more in schools or like you one-on-one, like you would go out of your way to then learn more about unbiased news. But I do think that it's harder for social media platforms to like implement nudging. And so I think the solution to this would be that we'd have to take it to some sort of level of the law and introduce it to like Congress and get it passed to the House of Representatives and then like Senate because I think that unless there's like an actual like problem that's addressed and like unless there's an actual like um unless there's like an actual way to solve this without having like any consequences, then I don't think that they're gonna just implement it. So as of right now, the only way to really be media literate is to focus on yourself.
Yeah, makes sense.